Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for High School Visual Art 3D. Today we're going to cover Assessments Continued. I am going to begin a demonstration for a project that will identify opportunities for diagnostic and formative assessments. Last time I talked about different types of assessments and had some examples of diagnostic and formative. Over the course of the next two sessions, I am going to provide a start to finish demonstration of a slab mug with a Mishima design. I really like this project. It's super comprehensive in that there is form and function, that there's an alternative surface design technique, and the students really like it because they love making anything that they can use. Throughout the steps of the project, I'm going to identify when and what type of assessment opportunities are appropriate for each step. So remember that assessment should be happening throughout the lesson from the beginning to the end and are going to start with diagnostic assessments. So I mentioned in my last session that this is going to be done to gauge where students are in their learning. And I get a lot of information out of doing a critique of student examples. I sometimes do this as a class, other times in groups. So I will typically provide them with a range of successes from really well done to maybe not so well done. And I will have them identify what's most successful to what's least successful. And you can really get a lot of understanding of what they know about form, what they know about craftsmanship, their understanding of function just by looking at these examples. Also, it's a really great way of sort of front loading the rubric. So if you look at these examples and you know that the one that is better has a more visually interesting design, when visual interest is part of their assessment, it should not be a surprise. When you can look at the handle on the one that is most successful and can tell that this person knew something about the stages of dryness of clay, and then you look at the handle on the third one and clearly the student attached the handle when it was too wet, then attention to stages of dryness or a knowledge of stages of dryness of clay could be on that rubric, no surprise. Surface intention, functionality, any of those things that you can talk about when they critique these images, which should not be a surprise then for them when it shows up on the instructions or the rubric. Sometimes as I mentioned, I will have the students look at this as a class when I'm able to. Other times I will have them in groups and do something a little bit more formal. So here's an example of a diagnostic assessment for this project where I had a student, a group of students, look at these mugs, order them from most to least successful, and then talk about specifics. So which is the most successful? Why did you choose that one? Identifying the elements and principles, talking about function again, and just having this written record is kind of helpful so we could go back and review. Sometimes if I don't have enough samples for everyone, I may put an example with each group. And of course, the students who get the really well done, really visually interesting examples feel like they've been given a gift. And then the ones that are less successful, are always very quick to point out the flaws. But then, bringing them then together as a group and having them, figure out which one they feel is better, and then maybe even having more of a range where you have, instead of just 3, maybe you have 6 or 8 that you can assess as a group. I try to have physical examples when I can, but obviously, if you are in a remote situation, or even when you don't want to have your kids in such close proximity, hovering over these examples, you may use images instead. I think there's something valuable in being able to pick up the object and turn it around in your hands and see what the functionality is like. But obviously, we have to do with what we have at this point. As you go from your diagnostic to your formative assessments, I feel like sketches are a really great sort of crossover. Sketches can work as a diagnostic tool if you're relying on previous knowledge that you feel students should already have about form or technique. If they aren't demonstrating that knowledge in their sketches, it may simply indicate that you didn't make that aspect of the assignment clear in your instruction, or it can mean that students never learned or didn't retain the information. So it may need reteaching or review. Mostly I consider sketches as a formative assessment. When you look at student sketches, you can see whether or not students have an understanding of what is being asked of them. I typically discuss sketches one-on-one. It is time consuming, but I think it's completely worth it. And I either give the green light or I literally send them back to the drawing board. The sketches that you see here are pretty informal. I rarely let students start construction until their sketches are approved. I also usually require notes on techniques, design, finishes, surfaces, etc. However, when they're all starting with a common predetermined form and they're all going to be doing the same surface technique, and especially if the form needs time to set up or stiffen between steps, I'll have them do their form first and then work on sketches. This set of sketches is for the project that I'm going to be demonstrating. For something like this, I'll actually teach them how to draw in 3D. So this would be an entry-level ceramics class. So, we'll talk about the difference between a rectangle and a cylinder. And then, not with this one, because these forms really, since they don't really have a lot of variation from one point of view to the other, I will just make sure that they include the handle, but I won't make them do multiple views. I will also have them indicate, like you see the one on the bottom, I'll have them indicate which of the three designs, and 3 seems to be the magic number for me, but which of the 3 designs they're going to do, and then maybe talk about the principles. Here they're just listed. Typically I'll have them tell me how are they evident in the design. So the video here is the step 1 of the slab mug with the Mishima design. This first step, as you watch it, I would suggest looking for opportunities for formative assessment.
So the first thing that we need to do when we are making our mug is we need to get a 12-ounce soda can and a piece of plastic. As far as the soda can, you want to make sure that it doesn't have dents in it. And you also want to put a hole in the bottom so that when you remove it from the clay form, it does not create a vacuum. As far as the piece of plastic, you're going to need something a little bit thicker than, say, a grocery bag or saran wrap. So I usually use a little bit of a clay bag. Something like the thickness of a Ziploc bag will work. And I've cut mine to about 4 1/4 width. The length is less important because it can overlap itself. So somewhere around 9+ inches. And as I'm wrapping my can with my plastic, I want to keep it lined up to the top of this bevel on this can. And I also want to make sure that I'm keeping the plastic relatively tight against the can. We don't want it loose. We don't want there to be any wrinkles. So if you're using a piece of plastic that has been stretched at some point and therefore has maybe some unevenness in its surface, you maybe want to get a different piece. So you can pull it pretty tight. You're going to need a little piece of masking tape. And mine's being a little obstinate here, so bear with. And you want to make sure that you are not taping the plastic to the can. you want to make sure that you are taping it to itself. So just pop a little tape right there, and then your can is ready to go. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to roll our slab. So if you have recycled clay like I do, and it's not a nice slice off of a block, I always start by flattening my clay before I roll it to just, you know, take some of that, I guess, muscle work out of it, if you will. So just, you know, flatten it a little bit. And I usually use these old school rulers for something this size. I want about a 1/4 inch thick slab, and these rulers are about a 1/4 inch thick. So basically, by keeping the rulers inside the width of my rolling pin, as long as I'm rolling, I guess, perpendicular to the rulers, it will ensure that my slab does not get any thinner than the rulers. And you'll notice when you're rolling slabs, it's beneficial to pick your clay up once in a while, flip it over. I think that it gets stuck to the cloth sometimes, so you need to move it. And I cut out a template beforehand, and this template is 4 1/4 by 9. So I know that I have more clay than I need. So I'm just going to cut this little bit up off the top. See that? And then I'm just going to continue rolling that end out. Flip it one more time. I always tell my students that they want to roll until the clay isn't moving any longer, so that it is, you're rolling against those rulers and the clay is no longer stretching out. Okay, so I have my template. I'm just going to use a needle tool to cut out my slab. For my template, I've used a piece of paper that's a little thicker than your printer paper, or if kids have notebook paper, I used a cardstock. It's kind of hard to cut a slab out along really flimsy paper. It's easy to go off the line or to get a crooked line because the paper doesn't really pose any kind of barrier to cutting into that slab. So if I'm lucky, I have enough clay that I've cut off the end to act as my base, but I did not do that this time. So I am going to cut a separate slab. So I'm going to put my one that I'm wrapping around the can to the side, and I'm just going to smash my trimmings together. And typically, you know, if you're going to do this, you would wedge your clay, but I find that with this really thin slab construction, if I smash it down pretty well, I'm not really getting any air pockets. And it dries so, thoroughly because of its thinness that it doesn't really create any problems. So this is definitely going to be big enough for our base, but I'm not going to cut it down just yet. So I'm going to set that aside and come back to our larger slab. So I have my can that I've wrapped my plastic around. My can has a hole in the bottom. I'm making sure that that plastic is right at the top of this bevel on my can, and that is where I'm also lining up the clay. So I line the clay up at this bevel. You want to try to prevent plastic from being longer or going beyond your slab, because once you put that base on, you don't want there to be plastic in that seam. So I have a little bit of overlap, and that's fine. I'm going to just take my needle tool and I'm going to cut through both layers. And I don't want to press while this is on the table because I don't want to flatten this side. So let's see. Okay. And then of course, I'm going to score both edges. And apply some slip. My slip is pretty watery today. I'm going to push those two edges together. And they should line up if you used a nicely measured template and you cut carefully along that template. And at this point, I'm not going to concern myself too much with making this exterior pretty. You may be able to see that I do have some of the imprint from the canvas, and then, you know, obviously you can see where my seam is, and I am going to get rid of that, but not right now. It's really soft, and I want to let the clay stiffen up a little bit before I do that. So we brought the clay to the bevel, so now I'm going to just push my can all the way, or the clay, I should say, all the way down. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take, and instead of trying to make the base the perfect size, which it would be difficult because even though we're measuring and we like to think that we are perfect, it is very difficult to make something precise. So it's easier to cut your base larger than it needs to be and cut away the excess. I like using a needle tool because it lets me get in close and do a nice curve. Sometimes a blade is a little more difficult to get that precision. Okay. And I'm going to hold on to this clay because we're still going to use it. Now, getting back to the fact that, you know, we are not perfect, we want to make sure that this base is going to fit after we score and slip. So I'm going to make a mark. So I know that this mark should line up with that mark, so I'll know exactly where to put that base after I score it. So I'm scoring my two edges. I'm going to sound effects. We got dogs and fire trucks. It's very active here this evening. Okay, so I'm going to find my mark. Where'd you go, Mark? There we go. All right. Let me get that all lined up. And it looks like it fits pretty well. And then I'm going to take a rib tool or whatever it is you use to smooth. During remote instruction, I've been having pretty good luck with expired gift cards because they're nice and flexible. I'm just going to start at the base and pull upwards, and that's going to help seal that base to my cylinder. And I'm going to scrape some of this clay off. Be careful if you do this with a metal rib, because you can potentially cut your finger. Let me be a cautionary tale. And I'm just going to go ahead and start at the bottom, pull this rib tool all the way up. And you can see that I'm not removing a bunch of clay. I'm just smoothing out that surface a bit. Again, I'll go back and refine that more a little bit later, but I just want to get that canvas imprint off while my clay is still nice and soft. So another thing that I like to do is, your students could have their can or their cylinder, their clay, just in a straight vertical walled cylinder. I like to use that bevel and slightly round the foot in. I think it makes for a nice shape. You may displace some clay that you might need to scrape off the foot. And then I'm going to repeat that process of starting at the bottom and pulling up. And you can see that that just gives it a nice roundness there at the bottom. I'm going to set this aside. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make our handle. And the handle is just going to be simple coil construction. There are lots of ways to make handles. We're just going to do a simple ear shape. So just like with the slab, when I'm rolling a slab, I flatten out my clay before I roll it with a rolling pin, and just like coils, I do the same thing. So I squeeze the clay into a coil before I start rolling it. That'll also let me know if I've got more clay than I need, which I do. So one of the conversations you want to have with your student is, obviously, when you're making something like a mug, is functionality. So think about the practicality of a handle. Typically, a mug handle is thicker at the join, so I always have my students roll a little bit more in the center of the coil than on the ends, so that they have this thick area to attach. I form it, and then I cut the end. And you want to make sure that your handle is going to fit on your mug. So I just set mine on a flat surface so that it can rest like that. And if it's going to sit on a flat surface like this and be in, nice and even, and it should be nice and even on your mug. So that I would just set aside. I don't want to attach anything yet because we're still in the early stages. And I think if you attach a handle right out of the gate, and then you go back in and try to do design and try to refine and smooth, the chances of knocking that handle off are pretty good. And because the handle is thin, it's going to start drying faster. So I have a form that I made earlier. A little imperfection in it there. And I've done a pretty fair amount of smoothing on this one. I have not addressed really the rim a whole lot, and obviously I have not addressed the interior. because the can is still in it. You want to make sure before removing the can that your form is stiff enough to hold its form, its structure. If you take that can out and it is still soft or flimsy, and then you go pushing around on it, it's gonna collapse or become misshapen. So you do want to make sure that it is the appropriate time to pull the can off.
So I hope that you enjoyed that first step of the slab mug with the Mishima design. Formal assessment opportunities for this step one could have started with the preparation or formal or informal assessment opportunities for formative assessment could have started with the preparation of the template and mold. Does the plastic fit tightly around the can? Is there a hole in the bottom of the can? Is the paper template cut correctly? And this is something that can be done pretty quickly and corrected in real time. I don't think it's necessary to assign a grade or points every time you do a formative. Sometimes it's just to make sure that the kids are on track. Another could be how well the student applied the clay to the mold and attached the base. This could include scoring and slipping the edges to one another and to the base. And lastly, we could formatively assess the functionality and craftsmanship of the handle. All of these are pretty informal ways of checking progress and understanding. And I think if you aren't able to address each student's work, you can have them document and post it onto some platform. This is a really great way to also hold students accountable for their progress. We are only one person and can only get to so many kids. But I think what's important to remember about formative assessment, and for me, formative assessments are maybe the most important assessments that we do, because it's those little benchmarks across the spectrum of an assignment. But I think it's important to remember that formative assessments can be formal or informal. So you can have them, do a little in-process critique. I think timely feedback is critical. If you are at a part, if the kids' plastic does not fit on the can very well, or there's not a hole in the can, then, you certainly don't want the kid moving forward with construction. And again, it's a really great way to keep students accountable for their own progress. I hope you found the presented info useful today. Next time, I will continue the final steps of the project along with a discussion about summative assessment. I hope you tune in. Thank you.